The 17th of January 1944, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with a wet, living heat. Vines thick as a man's wrist choked the mahogany trees, and the air hung so heavy with moisture that every breath felt like drowning on dry land. In a clearing hacked from the green wall, a single Marine corporal stood before a mountain howitzer, a squat, brutal piece of American steel weighing 420 pounds without its carriage. His name was Daniel Kovacs, a farm boy from Ohio who'd spent his youth moving hay bales and wrestling plow horses through frozen February fields. Around him, Japanese prisoners of war sat in a loose semicircle, guarded but watching, their faces carrying that particular expression of men who had surrendered their weapons, but not yet their certainty. They had been laughing moments before. Quiet, polite laughter, the kind that comes from disbelief rather than cruelty. One of them, a former sergeant from Hiroshima, had gestured at the rope-and-pulley system. Kovacs was rigging around the howitzer's barrel, then made a comment in Japanese that sent ripples of amusement through the group. The translator, a Nisei intelligence officer named Takeshi Yamamoto, had hesitated before passing it along. He says this looks like something from a children's puppet show. He asks if Americans have forgotten how real soldiers move artillery. The insult carried weight because it carried history. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Army had watched American forces lumber across the Pacific with their mountains of equipment, their endless supply chains, their mechanical dependence. Japanese soldiers had been trained to move through jungle and mountain with almost nothing, a rifle, a handful of rice, and the certainty that spirit would triumph over steel. They had seen their own artillerymen disassemble mountain guns and carry them piece by piece up cliffs that American engineers said were impassable. They had hauled Type 41 infantry guns through swamps by hand, 40 men to a piece, moving with a discipline that bordered on the supernatural. And they had been told, again and again, that this was what separated them from the soft Americans who needed machines to do a warrior's work. So when Kovacs began wrapping rope around the howitzer like a farmer trussing a hog, the laughter seemed justified. Even their defeat, and they knew they were defeated, sitting in that clearing with their weapons taken and their empire crumbling, even that could not erase the muscle memory of superiority. They had carried guns up mountains. They had done impossible things with nothing but will and calloused hands. And here was this corn-fed American boy with his absurd pulley system, preparing to embarrass himself. What the prisoners did not know, what they could not have known, was that the rope and pulley was not a replacement for strength. It was a multiplication of it. Kovacs had learned the principle during a long winter on his father's farm, when a blizzard had collapsed the barn's main beam and trapped 3 dairy cows under half a ton of frozen timber. His father, a man who believed in silence and work, had rigged a similar system using chain and a come-along, then showed his son how leverage could make 1 man into 10. "It's not about being stronger," his father had said, breath steaming in the barn's cold. "It's about being smarter about where you put the strength you've got." That lesson had stayed with Kovacs through basic training, through the hell of Guadalcanal, through every impossible task the Marine Corps had thrown at men who were supposed to move equipment designed for machines. The pulley system he'd rigged was ingenious in its simplicity. 1 rope ran from the howitzer's barrel through a block anchored to a tree 20 feet away, then back through a second block attached to the gun itself, then to Kovacs's hands. The mechanical advantage was roughly 4 to 1, meaning every pound of force he applied would translate to 4 pounds of lift. It was basic physics, the kind taught to midshipmen at Annapolis, and ignored by everyone else because Americans had trucks and cranes and bulldozers. But on Bougainville, where the jungle turned roads into rivers of mud and equipment broke down in the humidity, basic physics became battlefield magic. Kovacs checked the rigging 1 final time, then wrapped the rope around his hands and planted his feet. The prisoners had stopped laughing now, watching with the focused attention of men who recognized a test when they saw one. In the Japanese military tradition, there was honor in attempting the impossible, but only if you succeeded. Failure meant shame not just for yourself, but for everyone who shared your uniform, your family name, your nation. These men had failed already by surrendering. Watching an American fail might return some small measure of balance to the universe. Kovacs pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. The rope went taut, the pulleys creaked, and 400 pounds of steel artillery remained stubbornly married to the earth. Then, inch by inch, the howitzer's barrel began to rise. Kovacs's face flushed red with effort, the cords in his neck standing out like bridge cables, but his feet stayed planted, and his back stayed straight farm boy form, the kind of lifting posture that comes from years of moving heavy things without breaking yourself. The gun rose to waist height, shoulder height, higher. The clearing had gone completely silent. When the barrel reached the vertical position, Kovacs tied off the rope and stepped back, breathing hard but standing steady. The howitzer hung in the air like a monument to applied physics, swaying slightly in the humid breeze. He looked at the prisoners, not with triumph but with the calm of a man who had just completed an ordinary task in an ordinary way. Then he began lowering the gun, controlling its descent with the same methodical patience he'd used to raise it. The former sergeant from Hiroshima spoke again, and this time there was no laughter in the words. The translator's voice was quiet. He says he has never seen this done before. He wants to know if all Americans can do this. The question revealed the crack in Japanese military ideology that would eventually shatter it completely. They had built their entire doctrine around the idea that spirit and discipline could overcome material disadvantage, that a soldier who could carry 60 pounds through a jungle for 3 days straight was worth more than a soldier who needed a truck. And in many cases, they had been right. Japanese forces had achieved victories that should have been impossible, moving through terrain that American planners said was impassable, fighting long after Western military doctrine said they should have collapsed. But they had mistaken the specific for the universal. They had turned necessity into virtue, starvation into strength, suffering into superiority. The Americans weren't weak because they had trucks. They had trucks because they were smart enough to build them. And when the trucks didn't work, when the jungle swallowed the roads and the mud drowned the engines, they adapted. They used their abundance not as a crutch but as a foundation. A Japanese soldier could carry his rifle and 40 pounds of equipment through impossible terrain because he had no choice. An American soldier could move a 400-pound gun by himself because someone had taught him about mechanical advantage, because there was enough rope in the supply depot to experiment with pulley systems, because the military culture valued problem-solving as much as it valued courage. This was the truth that the prisoners in that clearing were beginning to understand. American abundance wasn't making American soldiers soft. It was making them dangerous in entirely new ways. The evidence had been accumulating for months, though Japanese command had refused to see it. On Guadalcanal, American Marines had jury-rigged field telephones from captured Japanese equipment and spare wire, creating communications networks that should have been impossible with the resources available. On New Georgia, Seabees had built a functional airstrip in 16 days through jungle that Japanese engineers had declared unbuildable. At Tarawa, Marines had used Bangalore torpedoes and flamethrowers to crack defensive positions that were supposed to be invulnerable. Not through superior courage, the Japanese defenders had fought with suicidal bravery, but through superior application of industrial firepower. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. American forces that should have been crippled by soft living kept finding ways to do impossible things with the material advantages they'd been given. There was a documented moment, recorded in the diary of a Japanese naval officer captured at Rabaul, that captured this realization. He wrote, "We were told that the Americans could not fight without their machines, that they would collapse when faced with hardship. But we were asking the wrong question. The question is not whether they can fight without machines. The question is, why would they ever need to? They bring the machines with them. And when the machines fail, they turn themselves into machines. We have been fighting ghosts of our own propaganda." The rope and pulley became a symbol of this gap not just in material resources, but in the fundamental approach to warfare. Japanese military doctrine, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and decades of militaristic education, emphasized purity of spirit. Soldiers were taught to overcome obstacles through will and discipline, to see suffering as purifying, to treat death in service of the emperor as the highest possible achievement. This created armies capable of extraordinary endurance and shocking ferocity, but it also created a rigidity that mistook method for principle. When Japanese forces encountered problems, they solved them through greater application of the same virtues: more discipline, more sacrifice, more suffering. The idea that you might solve a problem by changing the approach, by using a pulley instead of more men, by building a truck instead of creating stronger backs, was philosophically alien. American military culture, by contrast, was pragmatic to the point of chaos. The U.S. military in 1944 was a bizarre hybrid of competing philosophies: West Point formalism and frontier individualism, industrial efficiency and cowboy improvisation. It was an army that issued field manuals for everything but expected soldiers to ignore them when necessary. It valued both discipline and innovation, which should have been contradictory but somehow worked because the underlying principle was simple: win the war, using whatever methods got the job done. If that meant a Marine corporal inventing a pulley system to move artillery by himself, fine. If that meant Seabees building an unauthorized airstrip because they thought they could do it faster than waiting for approval, also fine. The chaos was the point. American abundance created room for experimentation, and experimentation created solutions that rigid doctrine never could. By late 1944, this difference was becoming visible even to Japanese command. Intelligence reports from the Philippines described American forces adapting tactics in real time, sometimes changing their entire approach mid-battle based on what was or wasn't working. Field interrogations revealed that American NCOs had authority to make decisions that would have required approval from senior officers in the Japanese system. Captured equipment showed modifications and improvements that had clearly been made in the field by soldiers and Marines who saw a problem and fixed it without waiting for engineers to design an official solution. The Americans weren't just outproducing Japan, they were out-adapting them, turning their material advantage into a kind of battlefield evolution that Japanese rigidity couldn't match. The rope-and-pulley moment crystallized this. Kovacs hadn't been trying to prove anything philosophical. He just needed to move a gun by himself and had remembered something his father taught him about leverage. But to the Japanese prisoners watching, it was a revelation about the nature of strength itself. They had been taught that real strength came from within, that reliance on tools and tricks was a sign of weakness. But here was this American who had used a tool to multiply his own strength into something greater than the sum of its parts. He hadn't replaced human effort, with mechanical advantage he'd combined them, and the result was a kind of power that pure spirit alone could never achieve. In the weeks that followed, other prisoners began asking about the pulley system. Some wanted to know how it worked, approaching it like a puzzle they needed to solve. Others wanted to know if Kovacs was unusually strong, or if any American could do the same thing. The translator, Yamamoto, patiently explained the physics-mechanical advantage, force multiplication, the simple machines that formed the foundation of engineering. Some prisoners seemed to understand immediately, nodding with the recognition of men who had just seen something obvious that they'd somehow missed their entire lives. Others resisted, arguing that this wasn't real strength, that it was a trick, a cheat, proof that Americans needed crutches to do what Japanese soldiers did with their bare hands. But the resistance was hollow, and everyone knew it. They were sitting in a prisoner of war camp on an island their army had lost, part of an empire that was losing the war so badly that even the most optimistic propaganda couldn't hide it anymore. The trick had worked. The cheat had won. And all their purity of spirit, all their discipline and sacrifice, all their willingness to die for the emperor, none of it had been enough to stop the Americans from island-hopping their way toward Tokyo. There was a broader symbolism at work, though it would take historians decades to fully articulate it. The rope and pulley represented a fundamentally democratic approach to power. In the Japanese system, strength flowed from the top down, from the emperor to the generals, to the officers, to the soldiers, each level commanding absolute obedience from the level below. Individual initiative was valued only insofar as it served the collective will as defined by superiors. This created a kind of efficiency in execution, but it also meant that innovation had to be approved before it could be implemented, that solutions had to fit within existing doctrine before they could be tried. The American system, chaotic and contradictory as it was, distributed power differently. A corporal like Kovacs could invent a solution to a tactical problem without asking permission, and if it worked, it would spread through the informal networks of NCOs and junior officers who shared information like bootleggers trading recipes. The abundance of material, the endless supply of rope and pulleys and steel and fuel created space for this kind of experimentation. Soldiers could try things and fail without catastrophic consequences because there would be more equipment tomorrow, and when something worked, it could be adopted widely without waiting for official doctrine to catch up. This was the advantage that Japanese military planners had never understood. American abundance wasn't just about having more tanks and planes and ships. It was about having enough resources that individual soldiers could experiment, adapt, innovate, and fail without threatening the entire war effort. It was about creating a system where a farmer's son from Ohio could remember something his father taught him about leverage and use it to move a mountain howitzer by himself, and nobody would court-martial him for departing from standard procedure because standard procedure was understood to be a starting point, not a sacred text. The war would grind on for another year and a half, through Iwo Jima and Okinawa, through firebombings and atomic bombs, through horrors that made Bougainville look like a training exercise. But the essential truth revealed in that jungle clearing never changed. The Japanese fought with extraordinary courage, with a willingness to sacrifice that still awes military historians. But courage alone was not enough. Spirit alone was not enough. Discipline and sacrifice and purity of purpose, none of it was enough to overcome an enemy that could combine material abundance with pragmatic innovation, that could turn farm boys into engineers and give them enough rope to reinvent artillery tactics on the spot. In the end, the rope and pulley was more devastating than any battleship, more powerful than any bomber. It represented a way of thinking about power that Japanese militarism, for all its strengths, could never match. Not because Americans were better or braver or more disciplined, they often weren't, but because American democracy, messy and inefficient as it was, had created a military culture that valued solving problems over following procedure, that rewarded initiative over obedience, that gave ordinary soldiers the tools and the freedom to do extraordinary things. Years later, after the war, the former sergeant from Hiroshima would write his own memoir. In it, he described the moment he watched an American Marine lift a 400-pound gun using nothing but rope and trees and basic physics. He wrote, "I realized then that we had lost the war long before the first bomb fell. We had been fighting the America we imagined, soft, weak, dependent on luxury. But the real America was something different. It was the country that taught farm boys about leverage and gave them enough rope to prove it. We were fighting men who had every advantage and still knew how to use their hands. We never had a chance." The howitzer stood in the clearing, silent and massive, as the tropical sun began its descent toward the horizon. Kovacs had moved on to other tasks, other problems that needed solving with whatever tools and knowledge he happened to have. The prisoners remained, processing what they had seen, beginning the long psychological work of understanding how they had been beaten by an enemy they had been trained to despise. And in the space between those two groups, victor and vanquished, abundance and austerity, innovation and tradition, hung a truth as old as civilization itself, that power flows not just from strength or spirit or discipline, but from the ability to multiply what you have into something greater than yourself. That a man with knowledge and tools and freedom to use them both is worth more than 10 men with only their hands and their obedience. That democracy's greatest weapon was never its tanks or planes, but its faith that ordinary people, given resources and freedom, will find extraordinary ways to use both. The rope swayed gently in the evening breeze, still tied to the tree, still ready for whatever impossible task tomorrow might bring. And in that simple loop of fiber, that tool as old as agriculture itself, lay the entire story of why the Pacific War ended the way it did, not with samurai spirit, but with Yankee ingenuity. Not with beautiful death, but with practical life. Not with purity, but with pragmatism. The empire of the rising sun had fought with everything it had, sacrificed beyond measure, died with honor. But honor could not defeat a nation that taught its sons to build pulleys.